Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask to address the House and to ask unanimous consent to consume
Without
such time as
objection.
I may. Thank you so very much. I am glad that the manager, Congressman Poe, set the tone again for the vigorousness of the bipartisanship around what all of us want is to, in essence, cut out the cancer of human trafficking and sex trafficking. Let me first of all congratulate Mr. Poe, Judge Poe, a Texan whose language I can fully understand, and as well his partner, Congresswoman Maloney. We have worked together over the years, and she has championed the rights of women and the empowerment of our children. What a great partnership, Judge Poe and Congresswoman Maloney. And I'm delighted to join with them in my commitment and work on fighting human trafficking and sex trafficking, in supporting H.R. 181, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015. Marked up in Judiciary, with many amendments were accepted, and so this bill has a holistic approach. I'm also glad that we did not run away from this issue in Houston as we convened a hearing that I called for with my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, to openly and forthrightly listen to law enforcement, to people who had been victimized, adults who were still suffering from what had happened to them as a child. This hearing was held in March, a field hearing on combating human trafficking in our major cities. And it was a fitting venue because, regrettably, Houston has been noted as a human trafficking hub in the United States. But it was the important contributions of my colleagues, many of whom are on this floor today, who added to the record to begin to craft or to continue to work on important legislation such as the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. I am glad that we are here again to move it so that it can be ultimately signed by the President of the United States. At that hearing, I heard testimony from federal, state, and local law enforcement officials regarding an operation the day before, during which they discovered and rescued 115 from a packed, rented stash house in South Harris County. It was not completely vetted as to whether or not all the individuals in the stash house, or some of the individuals, or a few, were victims of human trafficking or sex trafficking. I would venture to say that their future was not going to be a future worthy of promoting. 99 of those victims were men, 16 were women, one of whom was pregnant, and 19 other were juveniles. You wonder what would happen to the juveniles. I went to that stash house. It was a terrible scene. All of them had been kidnapped and smuggled into the United States, and as previously said, human trafficking, sex trafficking is a great business for those who are of that kind of vile mind, because they can use them and use juveniles over and over again. Some of whom, however, have been driven to such low ends of the earth, meaning they are victims, that their life is ruined, and some have probably been driven to suicide. Trafficking of any human being, especially domestic child trafficking, has no place in civilized society. The term slavery has often been used, and it is true that slavery exists around the world. We need to ensure that state and local law enforcement agencies have the tools, resources, and training necessary to identify, apprehend, and prosecute criminals who ruthlessly traffic in children. These children have suffered the worst imaginable trauma, and as a result, they require and are deserving of comprehensive and tailored services to assist in their recovery. We need to ensure that funding is in place to provide for such comprehensive services. This bill is an essential step toward combating the crisis of domestic minor sex trafficking and helping survivors begin their new lives. Throughout this afternoon, we've said they have to have an opportunity to change their lives. While the rescue of trafficking victims is necessary, so is the prosecution of traffickers. And while we habitually refer to those solicited commercial sex acts for minors as customers and Johns, I've said this before on the floor, the cold hard fact is that these people are nothing more than child rapists. I'll say it again, child rapists. We need to stop being polite and call them what they are, child rapists. Let us not let them hide behind a polite name such as John particularly when they prey on our children. Federal courts have interpreted the existing statute, Title 18 U.S.C. Section 1591, to cover the acts of patronizing and soliciting. Therefore, the specifications of the terms patronize and solicit in this bill simply clarify and emphasize the fact that these actions are actually covered. Those who patronize and solicit are already criminally liable under the language contained in the original text of 1591. Under this legislation, child rapists will no longer be able to find refuge in any jurisdiction. This bill will also promote the coordination of investigation among federal, state, and local law enforcement and enhance reporting data for missing children. Everything that the witnesses at the March 2014 hearing told us called for this. Let me say that I am also grateful that this bill emphasizes the local, state, and federal collaboration. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee, which is what the hearing was held under the auspices of the Homeland Security Committee, we recognize that that is part of the threat to the national security. The utilizing of our children, the victimizing of our children, the co-opting of our children, the soliciting of our children, and this bill gets right at the target. Human trafficking is the second fastest growing criminal industry in the world, generating over $32 billion annually. This bill is the most comprehensive piece of legislation to deal with this problem over the years, and it is a great foundation upon which to continue to build, to weed out every nuance, every person hiding behind the rock who is dealing in sex trafficking and human trafficking. For years, we've labeled child victims of sex trafficking as prostitutes, juvenile delinquents, rather than as the victims they are. We've seen runaways, and we've condemned them for being a runaway. And we don't know the horrible stories of which they have experienced. They are victims of criminal conduct, and we need to treat them that way. Not prostitutes, not juvenile delinquents. This bill recognizes and treats victims as victims, provides for more services and shelters for them, and provides resources to law enforcement, child welfare, healthcare officials, and others who will come into contact with them. One of the early organizations, the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which I associated with throughout my entire time in the United States Congress, early on raised the clarion call that we must do something about these exploited children and missing children. I know that they are celebrating as we have been on the floor talking about human trafficking and sex trafficking. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that the Judiciary Committee saw fit to adopt Section 11 of H.R.181, the Jackson-Lee Amendment, which expresses a sense of Congress that human trafficking has no place in a civilized society and that perpetrators of such vile acts should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and we can build on this for finding those who may be thinking that they are squeezing outside the law. Mr. Speaker, as a global leader in combating human trafficking throughout the world, the United States must hold all nations to the same standards by which we hold ourselves. The demand for commercial sex is a primary cause of the human rights violation of human trafficking. Elimination of that violation requires the elimination of that demand. I am glad that we are here confronting it head on, and I ask my colleagues to support this underlying legislation. And with that, I reserve my time.
The gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
It gives me great privilege, Mr. Speaker, to, as Congressman Poe indicated earlier, to yield time to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Carolyn Maloney, who, as I indicated, has worked without ceasing on empowering the most vulnerable, particularly in her work on empowering women, vulnerable women around the world, providing them rights, and then, of course, her work that she's done in collaboration with Congressman Poe and our committees on this bill. We thank her, and I yield 4 minutes to her. Thank her for her service.
Thank you, and I thank my good friend and colleague for her leadership on this issue and so many others, and for yielding to me. I want to commend the Republican and Democratic leadership for bringing to the floor a large number of bipartisan bills to address the problem of human trafficking. I particularly want to thank Judge Poe for his enlightened leadership. He has brought an informed, intelligent, effective focus on this crime and brought new momentum that is helping this country address it. And I thank the Bipartisan Women's Caucus that has made this goal, this common goal of attacking the exploitation of children as a joint priority for our caucus and for this Congress. It is an important way to mark the Human Trafficking Week. And this modern-day form of slavery happens all across the world. And we don't like to admit it, it is happening right here in America. And it's happening in our small cities, our big cities, every state, every race, creed, and color. And there are no reliable estimates, but by some accounts there are as many as 2 million minors trafficked within the U.S. alone. And when they have missing children reports, many of the parents believe their children have been stolen into sex trafficking. Most of these child victims who are sex trafficked are United States citizens or are here legally in the United States. And human trafficking, as my colleague pointed out, is the fastest growing crime and the third largest criminal activity in the world. But unlike drugs and guns that are sold only once, human lives can be sold repeatedly over and over and over again until their lives are shattered and destroyed. It destroys lives and comes with a huge social and economic cost. We can all agree that no child should be for sale in America. Not now, not ever. Our children should not be for sale. But they are for sale under the guise of human traffickers and pimps. I am very pleased to work shoulder to shoulder with Congressman Poe on the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. As a former judge and a former prosecutor, he knows firsthand how damaging this crime is to the lives of our young people, and it involves young boys too, and how difficult it is to get a conviction. So his knowledge in this area is tremendously appreciated, and his knowledge is in this bill, and I thank him for having been the key author on it and for his passion and hard work on it. This bill directly and specifically supports law enforcement training and prosecution of sex trafficking crimes, and it creates a domestic trafficking victims fund within the Treasury Department to support critically needed services for victims. We know there are not enough beds, there's no treatment. Many trafficked women tell me they get saved, but then they're put in a park with no place to go, and the traffickers come up and try to get them back into it. It goes after those who are trying to exploit children and vulnerable women, those who would profit off the misery of others by going after their wallets. It targets the demand side, the child abusers, the child molesters. Our Victims Fund will be financed through fines levied on those convicted of child pornography, human trafficking, child prostitution, sexual exploitation, and human smuggling offenses. Will the gentlelady grant me another minute?
Be delighted to yield the gentlelady another minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 additional minute.
The bill also makes it clear that it's not the victim who is sold and exploited who is the criminal. The criminal is the child abuser, who solicits a minor, or the trafficker, who puts a woman or man out on the street to be bought and sold. Human trafficking is harmful not only to the victims, but to society at large. Last May, this House passed this bill in total agreement, and I urge the Senate to follow it and pass it also. It's time to help the survivors get the resources they need to rebuild their lives and to punish the evildoers who purchase and sell these innocent children. I thank my colleagues for yielding me time. I yield back to Sheila. Okay. I'm fine. Thanks.
Gentlelady yields back. This is gentlelady from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Does the gentleman from Texas have additional speakers?
I'm ready to close.
And I will close. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Yield such time as I might consume. The previous speaker indicated that we are in the National Month acknowledging and recognizing the gravity of human trafficking. And I believe that it calls upon us to stand by the most vulnerable who really can't help themselves. My last comment before yielding was the demand for commercial sex is a primary cause of the human right violation of human trafficking. So eliminating that violation requires the elimination of the demand. What I might not have added, which a number of members have said, is the violence that goes along with sex trafficking and human trafficking. The violence that goes along when some entity, person called a pimp, which is an old-time term, really becomes an abuser, a violent abuser, and abuses the frail, small body of a little girl or boy because they really haven't risen to the occasion, provided them with their daily infusion of dollars to continue to do their dastardly work. As I've heard mentioned on this floor, we're not alone here in the United States. For those of us who met the victims of sex trafficking and human trafficking around the world, we understand that America's standards will help others. That's what's good about what we're doing today in the underlying bill, is that we set a standard that the world can look at, that we are not going to tolerate or be sufferers of the abuse of little children. Yesterday, as I listened to a great success story spoken about by the Prime Minister of Jamaica, relating their economic success, she was willing to talk about Jamaica's concerted effort at fighting human trafficking. An island where it might be easy for that trafficker to move from one place to the next. Here was a leader of government acknowledging the scourge of human trafficking and that Jamaican children were suffering and subjected to sex trafficking, and that it remains a serious problem, but we're going to fight it. And I felt very good about that, because you would think in an island that is very much dependent on tourism and entertainment would not have that calling and that cause. But yes, the fight is spreading. I believe the Jamaican government should be congratulated, and I ask other governments to take heed of the underlying legislation, rise to the standard, be part of the total elimination of cutting into the lives of children, of little boys, of little girls, of cutting them off from any kind of aspirations and hope that they could ever have. And maybe if we don't necessarily connect it, but we know the story of the 3 women that were held for a period of time in our own nation. Some started out as children. When they were ultimately found, they were women. One cannot help note that the violence that they described was a vile sex trafficking, human trafficking episode. And we don't know how many are around the nation that are today, as we stand on the floor of the House, suffering. So I thank Representative Poe. I thank my colleague, Representative Maloney, committee staff on both sides of the aisle to help address this issue. And as well, I'm glad that this particular legislation will set a standard that this dastardly series of acts will not be suffered by any human being, not only in this nation but around the world. With that, I ask support for H.R. 181 and yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back to balance for time. The gentleman